Hi, class. It's time to finally tackle the harder issue about healthcare, which is healthcare a right? And notice we have three authors. I like the three articles we have, obviously, or I wouldn't pick them, but let me tell you why I like them. So, first of all, they all give careful, nuanced views. There's no cookie cutters, caricatures, or stereotypes here. But they also tend to make these very important clarifications and distinctions because this is one of those topics where people often just aren't careful. For instance, as Buchanan will point out, there's a world of difference between saying everyone should have health care or even the government should provide everyone with health care and saying health care is a right. Those are actually different. Although the latter entails the former does not entail the latter. And so there's a lot of careful reasoning and clarification going on that should help us fix and situate our views. And so, anyway, I hope you enjoy the articles as much as I do, relatively speaking, I know. But let's just start with the Daniels. So, first of all, the Daniels is a complex type of egalitarian. He does think that there is some sense in which we should have uh, a certain type of universal health care and going to develop that view. Uh, but First, he's going to point out what some of the difficulties are. And the most important one that we talked about in the Vaughan introductory reading is that for healthcare, he sees it as a positive right. That is something that the government is required to provide. And positive rights are tricky in that you have to determine scope. That is, how much of a right to give you. And there has to be a line drawn somewhere. You can't just say, well, there's a right to health care, because that could mean this very, very minimum. For instance, in the US, hospitals are not allowed to deny life saving treatment in an emergency. They could deny long term life saving care, but if you show up dying at a hospital, they have to treat you independent of your ability to pay. That would be a really, really, really minimalistic to say everybody has that right. And some people make that claim even as an extension of right to life. But imagine someone said, well, no, no, everyone has a right to the best health care possible. So now think of some of the what's often called Cadillac healthcare plans that are part of the perks of CEOs and top earners. And imagining everyone having a right to that is a very different picture. And so as soon as you say the government has to provide health care, okay, that's a foot in the door, but we have to kind of draw this line. So he's going to, that is, Daniels is going to have to not only try to convince us that we should have health care as a right, but also to draw that line. So after discussing these kind of odd objections that don't quite work by some libertarians, the libertarian we're going to read is a little more careful. He turns to, uh, well, why think we have a right to healthcare? Uh, I've already mentioned that some philosophers think that healthcare is actually an extension of the right to life. Uh, Daniels doesn't go that way. Daniels instead says that healthcare is a special case of equal opportunity. And so in contemporary US, it is thought that uh, we do have a right to equal opportunity in certain things. So if you think of even how every building on campus is, there are elevators, not just steps for the differently abled. There's ramps for wheelchairs to be able to get up on the curb, et cetera, et cetera. Uh, they have a right to differently able to have a right to equal opportunity in this sense, opportunity to educate themselves at BGSU. And so we already are kind of familiar with what that model looks like. And what Daniels is going to maintain is that healthcare is an extension of equal opportunity. That if I don't have proper health care, then in fact I am being denied important opportunities. So think of some of the examples we just gave, and then imagine someone who needs a prosthetic leg doesn't have the ability to get it through healthcare. Well, it seems like in the same way that you're undercutting equal opportunity if you don't have an elevator, then you might be undercutting equal opportunity at healthcare. So says Daniels. And of course, there's going to be important limits built into that, etc. But let's add the second bit then. Well, where's the line? If healthcare is a right, we need to know where the line is drawn. And Daniel says that these difficult cases are resolved by what he calls normal functioning. So you don't have to be able to excel at your function. You just have to be able to normally function. And that's the healthcare that gets you to normal functionality when possible is what the government would be required. So he says, and I'm going to read the quote here: the individual is entitled to a specific service only if, in light of facts about a society's technological capabilities and resource limitations, it should be part of a system that appropriately protects for equal opportunity. So normal functioning is society relative, that it is limited by society's wealth and technological capabilities. And so it can be dynamic in the sense that it can change over time, and that's a good thing. But notice it's not a perfect thing. He's very honest about the fact that it still leaves some of the difficult cases out there. And he doesn't think that all needs are equally important. And so there's some general work to be done there. But again, let's hit the highlights. He's going to try to make the case that we have a right, not just that it would be nice, but that the government has a right to, or sorry, the citizens have a right to health care, which means the government has an obligation to provide it. And so there's a right because it's an extension of our right to equal opportunity, which if we have a right to equal opportunity, we have to have this certain basic health care. What basic health care? The stuff that's going to get us to quote unquote normal functioning, which is limited by the resources and technology of the society in which it exists. But otherwise, it's a pretty good answer. And notice he does give some kind of head nods towards people who are more libertarian minded. He's fine, for instance, if the ultra wealthy want to, well, not just the ultra wealthy, if anybody wants to buy more insurance, that is something fancier or a better plan, perhaps a Cadillac plan that gets you beyond kind of that minimum and baseline of normal functioning. Daniels is fine with it and doesn't have an argument against it because we're talking about a baseline rather than this absolute an equality in the baseline rather than this absolute equality. So that's the Daniels reading in 7 minutes. Obviously, that's supposed to help get you started and teach you to understand the reading. But that's where he's going. So let's turn to Buchanan. The Buchanan reading is even more nuanced because what Buchanan is ultimately saying is that, yeah, there's kind of a right to health care, but really it's the combined weight of 4 things we already have that does the kind of work we need for healthcare rights, and so we don't need to add anything else. So how does he get there? First of all, he points out that the debate is about a decent minimum of healthcare, not about health. Health is not a resource that can be distributed. Again, an important clarification. Another important clarification he makes, and one of the reasons I picked the Buchanan article, is he goes in and discusses very clearly that there's a difference between rights and utilities. Should sound familiar from Unit 1. We're not just saying, we're not just talking about whether it would be useful for everyone to have health care, useful as a policy, useful to individuals, etc. The question is whether it's a right, because rights are entitlements, and it's stuff that the government must give independent of any other utility considerations. And then lastly, the other important clarification that he makes is the one I already mentioned, that we have to be really, really careful. It's a bad inference from everyone should have health care, to healthcare as a right. Just because everyone should have it doesn't entail that it's a right. And like uh, Daniels, he sees a social relativeness to this baseline that we're talking about. The decent minimum is what he uses instead of normal functionality. And so, uh, if there's a right, it's a right to this decent minimum. So these are all these really important clarifications that Buchanan makes. And when we put all these pieces in place and really focus on what we are looking at, here's what Buchanan's going to say. He's going to say that instead of talking about the right to universal health care, he's going to say these more specific rights actually do the heavy lifting, and so we don't need to add this extra on top of it. So if we combine these other four special rights involving healthcare, we don't need a general right to healthcare. So what are these ones he's talking about? First of all, there are already special rights to healthcare. For instance, he thinks there's a special right to healthcare to historically oppressed groups to which society might owe something. He thinks there's a special right to healthcare for uh, compensation and to correct the harmed. So, to take an obvious example, if somebody hits a pedestrian with their car, they owe the person who was hit by a car is entitled to health care, not as a general entitlement, but because they were wronged and that needs to be made right, but it's made right by the person who does the damage rather than society. And we'll get into that a little more with the Engelhardt article. And then third, there's what he calls exceptional service, that if people do exceptional service to society or the government, then society and or the government should respond by giving them health care. So military, perhaps other government work, etc. And so these are special rights to healthcare that already exist. And Buchanan's going to say, but wait, there's more. There's other stuff that society does that kind of helps make up for and replace and set aside a need for universal health care. One is society has requirements towards harm prevention. So he gives the example of sanitation. If you think of clean drinking water, for instance, basic sanitation actually takes a huge load off of our healthcare. Part of uh, the health sphere we were talking about last video, public health sphere. So that's also things the government does towards health that aren't the same as universal health care. There are also arguments of what you might call prudential arguments, or he calls prudential arguments, that providing certain types of health care are ultimately a public good, and we as citizens should be willing to pay for public goods. So, think of installing safety mechanisms just to avoid the drag on society if somebody dies, or um, just if we don't want outbreaks of certain types of disorders and disease, then things like providing education, outreach, and even treatment is just part of the public good, that it's a price that we regularly do pay and should pay, that isn't that's ultimately healthcare, but is not coming from a right to healthcare, but is instead coming from just wanting to maintain a public good. And then, of course, his fourth consideration is that, well, when we're doing these kind of public good things that we might do out of beneficence, uh, we can't just have everybody voluntarily give money. We can't say, all right, everybody give $20 to solve this problem. Instead, we need this, what he calls a coercive mechanism that is going to organize and enforce. He gives the analogy of traffic, right? Well, we want this public good, that everybody's able to get from point A to point B safely and relatively efficiently. We can't just rely on the honor system for that. And so instead, because we want the public good, we have to have the government provide a coercive mechanism to achieve that public good. So these are but don't lose the forest through the trees. So these are these four things that we have already in the US that A, lead to some degree of health care among all the citizens, but B, are not stemming from a right to universal health care. Instead, they come from other things we already have. So the combined weight of these things kind of replaces a need for universal health care. If we have these other four things in place, then we end up giving people health care, perhaps even universal health care, but without maintaining that people have a general universal right to health care. So that's the Buchanan article. If you understand that logical point, then the rest is pretty easy. Lastly, let's talk about the Engelhardt. Engelhardt is a libertarian, and he's going to make a good libertarian case on it. Well, so first he thinks, and this is probably the most contentious point, he doesn't think it's legitimate to impose one version of justice among many. So if there's various different competing versions of justice, you can't force one. It's not okay for the government to force one on you. Of course, that's not the best point because every government in the world, including ours, is doing exactly that. So let's maybe set that one aside. Um, More importantly, though, is his point about lotteries. And so um, lotteries are his mechanism for kind of drawing out this consideration of when people are responsible and when they're not. There's a natural lottery. If no one is to blame, then no one is responsible for fixing the problem. So if no one is to blame for the problem, no one is responsible for fixing that problem. And that's in terms of responsibility. It's not saying, it wouldn't be nice, but that's claim one. So if you think of that in terms of a non-healthcare thing, let me give an example. I had the misfortune of having a tornado just destroy my backyard 2 weeks ago, just utterly gone. Okay, is the tornado anybody's fault? Well, probably not really. I, I, because of that, it would seem pretty weird if uh, BGSU decided to raise your tuition in order to fix my backyard. You might say, well, wait a minute. There's nothing I did there that contributed to that bad state of affairs, to that harm. And so Mickey is not entitled to my money to fix the problem. Now, of course, if anybody wants to donate to the Fix Mickey's Backyard Fund, they're welcome. Just kidding. I do not take money from students, but you get the point. So that's an example of a natural lottery where you just have good or bad luck by nature. But very similarly, and probably more importantly here, we could also talk about a social lottery that by social forces by chance, uh, that someone may be injured. But it's not a society's job to fix it. Instead, it's the injurer's job. So um, again, go back to a pedestrian who's hit by a car. It's not society's job to pay for that pedestrian's medical treatment. It's the person who injured them. It's the driver of that car. And so to do this, what we're trying to do is draw a distinction, he says, between what's unfair and unfortunate. It is the government's job to fix things that are unfair, but unfair means that someone has been wronged and therefore it must be fixed. So in the case where the pedestrian is hit, that's unfair. And it is the government's job to be coercive, to force that unfairness to be righted. By contrast, things that are happening by lottery, by chance, are what he calls unfortunate. And things that are unfortunate, like the tornado hitting my backyard, that's just bad luck. And that can't translate, he says, into talk of rights and adjudication. It is not the kind of thing where Mickey has been wronged, and therefore the government is not obligated to fix it. In fact, and then here we're kind of getting into the usual libertarian line. In fact, there's the opposite. Why? Because the only way to fix it with a positive right is through taxation. But if I am taxing somebody to fix what is unfortunate, that's going to be a problem because taxation is from income, income is property, and I have a right to my property. And so, what would end up happening is the government would have to interfere with my rights, take away my stuff in order to fix this unfortunate situation. And not that's not okay. We are actually violating a right rather than uh, shoring it up. And so that's going to be the Engelhardt article. That, well, what ends up happening is in healthcare, whether you have bad luck from nature or bad luck from society, it's ultimately just losing a lottery, and we can call that unfortunate. It's certainly unfortunate, and it would be nice of you, but not required, to help fix it. Only things that are unfair, only where someone has been wronged, and you might think of the compensatorial special rights that Buchanan mentioned. Only when someone has been wronged is it the government's job to step in and adjudicate. Instead, in these healthcare cases where someone has just unfortunately lost a natural or social lottery, the government not only uh, the government is actually violating rights, property rights, if they try to step in and adjudicate and fix this unfortunateness. All right, so that is those three articles. Again, these are definitely some thicker articles, and so kind of pay attention to a few things. One, they're careful, but sometimes that carefulness can be misleading to the introductory reader because they do a lot of clarifications of what they're talking about, what they're not. Don't lose the forest through the trees. Two, start with their big picture thesis. This is what each of them thinks. So the Daniels thinks that as an extension of equal opportunity, we have to provide health care for normal functioning. Buchanan thinks that there's not really a general right to decent minimum health care as a right, but that there are these four things that together kind of give some health care, some decent minimum health care anyway. And then Engelhardt says, well, no, there can't be a right to universal health care because that would be the government fixing not an unfairness but an unfortunateness, and the only way they could do so is by violating property rights. And so if you start big picture, that's what they're working towards. Hopefully things will be a little easier, but as always, please come see me or shoot me an email if you're having any trouble with any of these. See you next time.